confront it accidentally and fully. Happens to soldiers sometimes in battle when they find themselves doing things they can't believe they do. And then we're afraid of society. That would be the oppressive patriarchy, because society judges us harshly and mercilessly in many ways, and we don't like to plummet in the, what would you call it? We don't like to see our reputation savaged in front of the groups that we identify with. It's extraordinarily hard on us emotionally for that to happen, which I wrote about, for example, in Rule 1, which is a chapter, at least in part, that details out the fact that the neurochemical systems that track your comparative status in competence hierarchies also regulate the balance between your positive and negative emotion, such that if you suffer a social defeat, your proclivity to experience negative emotion radically increases, and your proclivity to experience positive emotion radically decreases. And people seriously do not like that. And it's no wonder, because who wants to be completely overwhelmed with sadness and bitterness and anxiety and resentment and disappointment and frustration and grief, and then also devoid of happiness? You know, it's the very definition of hell. And if a status defeat will increase that probability, then we will fight very hard to maintain our status positions, which we certainly do. That's another fear. And then, of course, we have the fear of nature, and we should, because, of course, nature, despite being the environment and this thing that we should be striving to protect and maintain, is also trying with all of its might constantly to make us ill and old and kill us, and is generally very successful at all three. And so there's every reason to be afraid of nature. And one night alone in the bush will pretty much convince you of that. And then people are also afraid of the unknown. And so those are the big categories of terror that human beings face. And to be naked on stage is to face at least 2 or 3 of those simultaneously. What would you say to a young man looking to get into politics?
And we are also going to be addressing the fact that we need to hide in a sports stadium to address serious issues. But I think to begin with, I'm going to hand over to Sam, and he's going to kick us off properly.
Sure, thank you. And first, thank you all for coming out. You really can't imagine how humbling this is to be here with you. You really should just take a moment to appreciate this from our side, because Justin Bieber is not coming out to sing in the middle of this, as amusing as that would be. And, though we put a date like this on the calendar with apparent confidence, there's really no guarantee that you guys are going to show up, and we will never take this for granted. So it's really an immense privilege to be here with you.
Well, you might as well start by writing down that URL. I'll show it to you again at the end of class. That's where the syllabus is. And the syllabus will tell you pretty much everything you need to know about the class. There's a text. This is it. It consists of readings from a larger text. I use it because it's old, but a lot of the theorists that we're going to talk about are also old, and so I found this particular text accurate. And many of the people that we're going to talk about have very sophisticated views of personality. And I think that it does you a disservice unless you read something that's sufficiently sophisticated so that you actually understand, at least to some degree, what the people that we're going to study were talking about. We might as well start, I suppose, with a definition of personality. It's hard to define something that's that general because when you're speaking about human beings, it's not that simple to figure out what constitutes personality and what constitutes something else. So I'm going to hit at it from a couple of different perspectives. And while I'm doing so, I would like you also to consider the nature of what you're going to learn. Human personality is essentially unfathomable. Human beings are unbelievably complicated, and we're nested in systems that are also unbelievably complicated. There are more patterns of connections between neurons in your brain than there are subatomic particles in the universe by a substantial margin. You can look up Gerald Edelman if you want to find out about that. And so it's not unreasonable to point out that you're the most complicated thing we know of by many orders of magnitude. And the probability that you can understand yourself in anything approaching totality is extraordinarily low. So this makes the study of personality something very daring and hopeless and complicated. Now, we're going to cycle through a very large number of theorists, and what you'll find is that although there are commonalities between them, there are marked differences. And so then you might ask yourself, well, what's the point of studying this sequence of theorists and ideas if there's no point of agreement between them? And I would say, first, there are points of agreement between them. Although personality hasn't advanced to the point where I would say that we have a homogeneous theory that's free of internal contradictions. But I would also say that personality is a hybrid discipline. It's partly science, but it's partly engineering. The clinical element of it, I would say, is more like engineering. And what engineers do is try to do things. They try to make something happen. And they are informed by theory. But the point is still to build something. And when you're working as a clinical psychologist, and most of the initial theorists that we'll discuss for the first little more than a third to a half of the course are clinical theorists, they're trying to build something. And they're dealing with very, very difficult conceptual problems because they're either trying to cure mental disorders or maybe even unhappiness and trying to bring about health. And the problem with that is that it's not a straightforward thing to define a mental disorder from a scientific perspective, because what's healthy mentally and what's not is partly social judgment, and it's partly socially constructed, and it partly has to do with norms, and it partly has to do with ideals, because you might also say that to be healthy is to be normal, but you could also say that to be healthy is to be ideal. And then of course you run into the problem of having to conceptualize an ideal, and it isn't self-evident that science is capable of conceptualizing an ideal, because ideals tend to fall into the domain of moral judgments, say, or philosophical judgments, rather than scientific judgments per se. So what I would say to you is that it would be worthwhile to approach this course as if you were an engineer of the human spirit, an engineer of your own spirit to begin with, but also an engineer of the spirits of other people, because as you interact with other people, you inevitably tell them what you want and what you don't want. When they give you what you want and what you admire, you respond positively to them, you pay attention to them, you smile at them, you focus your thoughts on them, you interact with them, and you reward them for acting in a particular manner. And when they don't respond the way that you want, then you punish them with a look, or by turning away, or by rejecting their friendship, or when you're a child, by refusing to play with them. And so we're engaged in the co-creation of personalities, our own and others. And that also brings up the same question: what is it that we are all collectively trying to be and trying to create? I suspect that you all have the experience of falling short of the ideal, an ideal that you hold for yourself or an ideal that other people hold for you. I suspect that you all feel the negative consequences of falling short of that ideal. Freud would conceptualize that as the superego imposing its judgment on the ego, you being the ego, the superego being a hybrid, I suppose, of external forces and also your internalization of those judgments and forces. Now, personality per se, I would say, has these elements of ideal and has structural elements as well, and we're going to talk about those more in the second half of the class. The structural elements can be lined up and outlined more scientifically. The second half of the class concentrates more on physiology, brain physiology, and on statistical approaches to the description of personality. I suppose you might say that that outlines the territory. The course is called Personality and Its Transformations because we have personalities, that's who you are now, but our personalities are also capable of transformation, of change. I mean, obviously, we think about that as learning. Some of that might be regarded as factual learning, and some of it might be regarded as learning how to perceive and behave. And I would say that the clinical psychologists that we'll cover to begin with are much more concerned with the nature of the implicit structures that shape your perceptions, and also the implicit structures that shape your behaviors and how they're integrated in relationship to your negative emotion, health, and well-being. Whereas the thinkers in the second half are more concerned about laying out the structural elements of those features and relating them to underlying, say, mechanistic phenomena, making the assumption, which seems warranted, that there's some relationship between your personality and the manner in which your brain functions. I'm going to try to provide you with a meta-narrative that will help you unite these different theories. I've often found it useful when I'm trying to remember something to have a story to hang the facts on. Otherwise, you're faced with the necessity of doing nothing but memorization, and it isn't obvious to me that memorization actually constitutes knowledge. What constitutes knowledge is the generation of a cognitive structure that enables you to conduct yourself more appropriately in life. And so I suppose you might say that a course in psychology, you could argue that a course in psychology, especially in personality, is a course in applied wisdom as well, assuming that wisdom is in part your capacity to understand yourselves so that you don't present too much of an intolerable mystery to yourself, and also to understand others so that you can predict their behavior, understand their motivations, negotiate with them, listen to them, and formulate joint games with them so that you can integrate yourself reasonably well with another person and with a family and in society. Well, the structural elements of personality might be regarded as the implicit structures that govern your perception and that tilt you towards certain kinds of behaviors. I can give you some examples. We can talk about the Big Five model just briefly. The Big Five personality model is a statistical model which we'll cover in detail, trait by trait, partly during the second half of the course. The way that the Big Five was generated was that it's been generated over about 50 years, that personality psychologists gathered together adjectives within the English language first that were used to describe human beings, as many adjectives as they could collect, and then subjected them to a process called factor analysis. And what factor analysis does is enable you statistically to determine, in some sense, how similar adjectives are to one another. So, for example, if you gave 1,000 people a list of adjectives to describe themselves with, and one of the adjectives was happy and another of the adjectives was social, you'd find that those who rated themselves high on happy would also rate themselves high on social, and those who rated themselves low on happy would also rate themselves low on social. And by looking at those patterns of covariation, you can determine what the essential dimensions are of human personality. One of the dimensions is roughly happiness. That's extroversion. Another dimension is neuroticism. It's a negative emotion dimension. So if you ask someone if they're anxious and they score high, say on a scale of 1 to 7, they're also likely to score high on another item that says that they're sad. And it turns out that negative emotions clump together, and so the people who experience more of one negative emotion have a propensity to experience more of all of them. There's another dimension called agreeableness, and agreeable people are self-sacrificing, compassionate, and polite. If you're dealing with an agreeable person, they don't like conflict. They care for other people. If you're dealing with an agreeable person, they're likely to put your concerns ahead of theirs. They're non-competitive and cooperative. It's a dimension where women score more highly than men on agreeableness across cultures, including those cultures where the largest steps have been taken towards producing an egalitarian social circumstance, like Scandinavia. Actually, the gender differences in personality there are larger than they are anywhere else. Another trait is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is an excellent trait if you want to do well in school and in work, especially if you're a manager and administrator. I can't say we understand a lot about conscientiousness, although it reliably emerges from factor analytic studies of adjective groups across different countries. Conscientious people are diligent, industrious, and orderly. Their orderliness tilts them towards political conservatism, by the way, because it turns out that your inbuilt temperament, your inbuilt personality, which constitutes a set of filters through which you view the world, also alters the manner in which you process information and influences the way that you vote. And so you might say, and I do believe that this is true, we've been doing a lot of research on this as of late, the more accurate a measure you take of someone's political beliefs, the more you find that personality is what's predicting them. And I think that's a reasonable thing to think about, because, you know, you have to figure out ways of simplifying the world, right? Because you just can't do everything. And so people are specialized. They have specialized niches that they occupy. You could think about them as social niches. A niche is a place where your particular skills would serve to maintain you. And so if you're extroverted, you're going to look for a social niche because you like to be around people. And if you're introverted, you're going to spend much more time on your own. And so if you're an introverted person, for example, you're going to want a job where you're not selling and where you're not surrounded by groups of people who are making social demands on you all the time, because it'll wear you out. Whereas if you're extroverted, that's just exactly what you want. And so the extrovert sees the world as a place of social opportunity, and the introvert sees the world as a place to retreat from and spend time alone. And it turns out that both of those modes of being are valid. The issue, at least to some degree, is whether or not you're fortunate enough to match your temperament with the demands of the environment, and I suppose also whether you're fortunate enough so that you're born in an era where there actually is a niche for your particular temperament, because it isn't necessarily the case that that will be the case. Imagine that all of these temperamental dimensions vary because of evolutionary pressure, right? So there's a distribution of extroversion, a normal distribution. Most people are somewhere in the middle, and then as you go out towards the extremes, there are fewer and fewer people. And what that means is that on average, across large spans of time, there have been environments that match every single position on that distribution, with most of the environments matching the center, because otherwise we wouldn't have evolved that way. And so sometimes being really extroverted is going to work well for you in a minority of environments, a minority of niches, and sometimes it's just going to be a catastrophe. I suspect, for example, that if you live in a tyrannical society where any sign of personally oriented activity is likely to get you in trouble, that being extroverted and low in neuroticism wouldn't be a very good idea, because you're going to be mouthy and happy and saying a lot of things, unable to keep your thoughts to yourself, and you're going to be relatively fearless. Now, I don't know that for sure, because we haven't done the studies that precisely match temperamental proclivity to environmental demand, but you get what I mean. So, conscientious people are industrious and orderly. We know a little bit about orderliness. It seems to be associated, strangely enough, with disgust sensitivity, which I suppose isn't that surprising. You know, if you take an orderly person and you put them in a messy kitchen, they respond with disgust and want nothing more than to straighten it all out and organize it and clean it. And there's tremendous variability in orderliness. And as I said, orderliness predicts political conservatism. It's not the only thing, but it's certainly one of the things. The correlation between conscientiousness and grades is about 0.4. It's about 16% of the variance. It's the second best predictor of university grades after intelligence. And we'll talk about intelligence during this course too. Intelligence is actually a relatively straightforward concept. I don't think I'll get into it today, but conscientious people, their industriousness and their orderliness makes them schedule their time. So they make efficient use of their time. They use schedules and that sort of thing. We haven't been able to figure out anything about the underlying biology or psychology of industriousness. We've tried really dozens and dozens of tests attempting to find a laboratory measure on which industrious people do better, and we failed completely. And there's no animal models of industriousness either. And so I would say it's a great mystery that remains at the heart of trait psychology. And maybe it's a human-specific category, you know? I mean, you can think of sled dogs maybe of being industrious, and maybe sheepdogs and animals that work like that, but of course they've been trained by human beings. But it isn't obvious that animals are industrious the same way we are. I mean, industriousness involves sacrificing the present for the future, something like that. And it seems like you have to be able to conceptualize time in order to sacrifice the present for the future. One of the things that I would recommend that you do as students in this course, and maybe in every course, speaking of industriousness, is come up with a plan of attack for the course and use a scheduler. You know, if you treat your university career like a full-time job, you're much more likely to succeed. And if you keep up on the readings and you keep up on the essays and all of that, then you're much less likely as well to fall into despair when you get too far behind. Using a Google Calendar or something like that to organize a schedule for the entire semester at the beginning of the semester can be invaluable, especially if you're not very industrious, because it can keep you on track. And one of the things we know about industrious people is that they are very good at using schedules and at planning the use of their time. And so I would like to say that you should all be smarter, but I don't know how you could be smarter. We don't know anything about how to improve intelligence, and I suppose we don't really know anything about how to improve industriousness either, but I can tell you that people who are industrious come up with a strategy for solving the problem that's ahead of them, and then they do whatever they can to stick to the strategy. And so, for example, if you sat down today or tomorrow for a couple of hours, 3 hours, and you filled in a Google Calendar, whatever you happen to use, with a strategy for studying, and a list of when all your assignments are due and all of that, and when you're going to sit down and study, then you won't be in a position where you have to cram for 10 hours a day hopelessly right before, you know, an important exam. It's also a very ineffective way of studying, by the way. I mean, first of all, people who cram for 10 hours say they're studying for 10 hours, but they rarely are because, well, I can't study for 10 hours. I don't have the power of concentration that would enable me to do that for that prolonged period of time. I can manage about 3 hours of intense intellectual activity before I'm pretty done. And it's also the case that if you study and then sleep and then study and then sleep and then study and then sleep, you space it out, then you're much more likely to remember. It's also much more likely that you're much more likely to remember if you try to recall the material. And so highlighting and that sort of thing isn't very useful, but reading, closing the book, summarizing what you've read without opening the damn book, that's useful. And the reason for that is that you're practicing remembering. And that's what you have to practice. If you're practicing memorization, you have to practice remembering. You don't just go over the thing over and over. That'll help you with recognition memory, but it won't help you with recall memory. Anyways, the last trait is openness. Openness is a creativity trait. It's also associated with intelligence, in that intelligent people, and I'm speaking technically of IQ, tend to be higher and tend to be more creative, which is hardly surprising. Creative people are more likely to be liberal politically, by the way. They like novelty, they like aesthetics, they like fiction, they like movies, they like art, they like poetry. There's something about them that grants them an aesthetic sensitivity, and that's an inbuilt trait. And it's not the case, by the way, that everyone's creative. In fact, far from it. We've used the Creative Achievement Questionnaire to measure people's creativity. I'll talk to you about that later in the class. And the Creative Achievement Questionnaire takes 13 dimensions of creativity. So, you know, writing, dancing, acting, scientific investigation, entrepreneurial activity, architectural activity, cooking. There's a handful of others, singing, etc. You know, the sorts of things that you would assume that people could be creative about. And then it asks people to rate themselves on a scale from 1 to 10 on their level of achievement with regards to all those creative domains, with 0 being, I have no training or proficiency in this area, and 70% of people score 0 across the entire creative achievement questionnaire. A tiny proportion of people are outliers, way out. They're creative in many dimensions simultaneously and exceptionally creative. And it turns out, as you'll find out, that pattern, which is called a Pareto distribution, where most people stack up at 0 and a few people are way out on the creative end, characterizes all sorts of distributions, like the distribution of money, for example, which is why 1% of the people have the overwhelming majority of the money. It's a different 1% across time. It churns, and you're much more likely to be in the 1% if you're older, logically enough, because one of the things you do as you age is you trade youth for money, if you're fortunate. I don't think the trade is really worth it, but that's the best you've got. So anyways, those particular traits, you can think of those as ways that you simplify the world, right? There's lots of different places that you can act in the world, and there's lots of different ways you can look at it and survive. That's why you can be a plumber and a lawyer and an engineer, and those all work, right? Even though they're very different modes of being. And you can have different personalities and survive, as long as you're capable of finding the place where your particular filters and behavioral proclivities match the demand of the environment. And a huge part, I would say, of successful adaptation is precisely that. Now, there are other elements of personality too. One of the things that I've been struck by, and this is actually one of the criticisms I have of the psychoanalysts and the clinicians in general, even though I have great admiration for them and would say that what they have to say is very much worth listening to, is that it's not obvious that your personality is inside you. You know, you think, you know, a human being is a strange multi-level thing. And you might ask yourself, well, for example, you know, is your mother more a part of you than your arm? Or maybe even more precisely, is your child more a part of you than your arm? And certainly people will do drastically self-sacrificing things to maintain the lives of their children. And so you're a person, and you're made out of all sort of subcomponents of a person, none of which you can see when you look at a person, all the complicated machinery inside you that makes you who you are. And then outside of that, of course, you're nested in all sorts of complex systems. So you're part of a family, and you're part of a community, and that's part of a province, and that's part of a state, and that's part of an international consortium of states, and that's part of an ecosystem. And how you make a distinction between you and the systems that you're embedded in is also of extraordinary difficulty. And one of the things that you have to do as a clinical psychologist, for example, if you're trying to diagnose someone with depression, you think, well, this person's dreadfully unhappy. Well, you can think about that as a problem with their psychological adjustment, you know, the way that they're looking at the world. But if you look at the epidemiological literature, for example, one of the things that you find is that very many people have a first depressive episode after something genuinely terrible has happened to them, right? They've lost someone, or they've become injured, or they've become unemployed, because unemployment is a terrible shock to people. And it's not precisely self-evident that you can consider someone who's unhappy and desperate because they no longer have a job depressed. They're certainly sad and they're not doing very well, but the fact that they no longer have an income is actually something with dramatic practical consequences. And treating that as if it's a mental disorder seems to be counterproductive. It's also the case, for example, that if someone comes into you to talk to you and they're very upset, and they may manifest the signs of, say, an anxiety disorder, or again, depression, or other clinical features for that matter. You have to do a careful analysis of their manner in which they're embedded in their family, because, and this is something that we'll talk about quite thoroughly when we come to discussing Freud, is that, well, you know, it's not like everybody's families are necessarily particularly happy places to be. You know, I mean, human beings are very dependent. We have a very long period of dependency, partly because we're so cortically hyper-developed. It takes a very long time to program us into something that's vaguely capable of maneuvering on its own, and that produces, of course, the very tight familial bonds that we all desperately require, because who wants to be alone in the world? But it also exposes us to the probability of becoming entangled into even multi-generational family pathology. And it isn't obvious always, and certainly hasn't been to me when I've seen my clients, that the fundamental problem with the client is the client. Sometimes the fundamental problem is the family. And perhaps that person has been identified as the problem person. It's rather convenient for everyone who's involved to make that presupposition. It's also the case that this is the Freudian idea fundamentally, this is the Oedipal idea, that it's very easy for people to become over-dependent on their parents, and for the parents to facilitate that, and then for the primary developmental problem for the individual, in fact, to become free of the interfering elements of the family so that they can exist as independent individuals. Well, and then of course there are cultural variations in that make that proposition complex, but that's a fundamental tenet, say, of Freudian psychology. A lot of the clinical psychologists, all of whom that we're going to study, have a pronounced Western orientation. One of the fundamental presuppositions is that part of the hallmark of positive psychological development is the creation of an individual that's capable of acting independently. And that's, I would say, an implicit ideal that lurks at the bottom of the clinical presuppositions of all the theorists that are classic psychologists. So that's a very old picture. It's Jonah emerging from the whale. It's a variant of a myth. The myth is the dragon myth, I suppose. The dragon myth is that there's a dragon that lives under the ground that's eternal, and now and then it rises out of the ground to threaten the state. And someone within the state determines to go confront the dragon voluntarily, and does so, and then brings back something of great value. Sometimes if the hero is generally male, sometimes the thing of great value is a female that the dragon has kidnapped. That's a St. George story. And sometimes it's gold, another treasure, like in the story of The Hobbit, and a story that you all know very well. It's a classic hero story, and the hero story is another fundamental element of the clinical theories, I would say. It's predicated on the idea that you learn through voluntary contact with that frightens or disgusts you. And that's a hallmark of psychoanalytic theory. Carl Jung, who we'll discuss in detail, said his primary dictum was insterquilinus invenitur, which I'm sure I'm massacring because it's Latin, but it meant in filth it will be found. And one of the hallmarks of the clinical theories is that within the confines of everyone's experience, and you can think about this as experience out in the world or experience in the unconscious mind, there are dirty little secrets, let's say, and skeletons and dreadful old fears and remnants of abuse and memories of pathological behavior and failures of courage that leave you undeveloped, perhaps out of avoidance, and that the psychoanalytic process is precisely the careful encounter with those forgotten and repressed elements of the self in the hope that a clear encounter will redeem them, unite them with the remainder of your personality, and make you stronger in consequence. And I would say that that's just a variant of the manner in which human beings learn, and we'll talk about this more in relationship to Piaget, because you always learn when you're wrong, which is very annoying. Now, what do you learn when you're correct? You're walking in the world, you're operating in the world, you have a sense of what you want to have happen. You're always looking at the world through this sense of what you want to have happen. You're acting so that what you want to have happen will happen. And when it happens, well, then you're happy because, well, first of all, you get what you want, and that's good, maybe, depending on what you want. But it's also good because if you get what you want when you act, then it turns out that your model of how to act is valid, right? The outcome that you get what you want indicates no error on the part of your model. But it's very frequently the case that when you act to get what you want, you don't get what you want. And then that's unpleasant because you don't get what you want. But it's even more unpleasant because it brings with it the hint of a suggestion that the manner in which you're construing the world is incorrect at some indeterminate level. So, for example, if you tell a joke at a party, you presume that people will attend, and then when they hear the joke, they will laugh. And then if you tell the joke and it goes flat, or even worse, disgusts and offends people, then you're going to be taken aback, and that's partly because you didn't get what you want, and that's not so good, but it's more because there's something wrong with the way you conceptualize the situation. And then you're faced with a problem, and the problem is the emergence of a domain of the unknown. It's like, well, what kind of mistake did you make? Maybe you're not as funny as you think you are. That could be a big problem. Maybe you're not around people who are the way you think they are. Maybe they don't like you as much as you thought they liked you. I mean, the potential for various paranoid thoughts of increasing severity to come welling up at you in a situation where you make even a trivial social mistake is quite broad. And when you make an error of that sort, you have to face it and sort through all the possibilities so that you can find out what it was that you did wrong and how to retool it so that in the future you don't make the same mistake. And that requires in some sense what you might describe as a journey into the belly of the beast being that place where things have fallen apart and where you're overwhelmed with negative emotion and chaos and confusion. And that's a very old story. That's the story of the journey to the underworld. And the hero is the person who makes the voluntary journey to the underworld to collect what's been languishing down there. And that's the basic motif of psychoanalytic theory. I would say it's the basic motif in some sense of clinical practice, because one of the things that you do as a clinician is find out what people are afraid of and what they're avoiding, and that can be in their past or in their present or in their future. Break it down into smaller pieces and help them devise strategies of approach and mastery, and that improves the quality of their personality and helps develop them into people who won't make the same mistakes over and over again. All right, so, well, why this plethora of tools? Well, I said, in some sense, being a personality psychologist is like being an engineer. You're trying to build better people. And you might say that if you're a carpenter or a mechanic, that your ability to fix a vehicle or build a house is dependent on your proficiency with regards to the use of a multitude of tools. And so then you might say, well, the more tools you have at your disposal, the more likely it is that you're going to manage things properly. And so what I would like to offer you is the possibility that what you're going to encounter in this course is a series of sophisticated conceptual tools that will help you understand yourself better and therefore better orient yourself in the world. I regard this course as intensely practical. And that's because I believe that you have nothing to rely on in your life that's more crucial to your success as you move through life than your character and your personality. That's what you bring to every situation. And the more sophisticated you are in relationship to yourself and others, the more you understand people, the deeper you understand the nature of your own being, the more likely it is that you're going to proceed through your life in a manner that will make you pleased to exist rather than displeased to exist. I've collected the writings of people that I regard as of incomparable brilliance. They're difficult to understand. Their concepts are complex, but it's not surprising because the subject matter is complex and vital. And so it requires work, and I would say try to keep up on the readings if you would. It's going to make the course much richer for you. And I would say, because people often ask me, well, how should I read for this course? Because there's a lot of reading. And the answer is, read as if it matters. That's the right answer. Don't be thinking about how it's going to be tested. If you do the readings and you come to the lectures, then the tests aren't particularly difficult. But you should read the readings as if the person is writing about you. And you should try to understand what the person says, because it's another tool for you to use. And I would say, well, with my clients, you know, I use the approaches of one theorist for one client and the approaches of another theorist for another client. It seems to me to depend to some degree actually on the temperament of the client. I found, for example, that people who are very high in openness, which is the creativity dimension, are quite amenable to a Jungian approach, whereas people who are more practical, conscientious, low in openness are much more amenable to a behaviorist approach. We don't really know enough about psychology yet to match treatment to temperament, but those are some of the things that I've experienced. Okay, practicalities. Well, there's a website. I gave you the URL. I'll put it up again at the end of class. The URL lists all the readings that aren't in the textbook. And so the textbook contains the classic readings from people like Jung and Freud and Piaget and so forth, Rogers. And as I said, I picked that particular textbook because I believe that the author did a very credible job of summarizing what's very difficult to summarize. So, and then also on the website there are links to papers, because much of the more modern material that pertains, say, to neuroscience and also to trait personality, I think it's better just to read the original papers, and I'll detail them out with you as we go through. And that'll also give you some familiarity with original psychological papers, which are, again, there's an idiom that you have to master in order to understand them, but you might as well practice it, especially if you're interested in continuing with psychology in your educational practice or as a career. It's good to get accustomed to it. So there again is the URL for the class. If you go to jordanbpeterson.com, which isn't too hard to remember, assuming you can remember my name, then classes are listed on the left-hand side. You can just find the syllabus there. All right, so here's what we're going to cover. Well, today, obviously, this is the introduction and overview. Class is a little strange this year because one day it's an hour and the next day it's 2 hours, so not exactly sure how we're going to negotiate our way through that, but we'll figure it out. Historical perspectives, mythological representations. Well, I told you that I would try to provide you with a meta-narrative that might enable you to link the theories that we're going to talk about together. So I'm going to describe to you what you might regard as a conceptual language. And as far as I can tell, it's that imagine that there are two kinds of things that you need to know. And I believe this to be the case. I believe that you need to know what the world is made of, and I suppose that's the proper domain of science. But then you need to know how to act. And that's a whole different thing. And you need to know how to act. That's the thing you need to know most of anything, because of course you're a living creature, and action in relationship to desired goals is everything to you. And you can think about that from a Darwinian perspective. You have to act at least so that you can survive, at least so that you can find a partner. That's life. And so part of the question is, well, how does the world look if you think about it as a place to act? And the answer isn't a place of value-free objects. That's not what the world looks like. And you can't act in a world of value-free objects because there's no way of choosing between them. If everything has zero value, why would you choose one thing over another? You live in a world where things present themselves to you as of different value. And that's partly a consequence of your temperament, although it's a consequence of other things. And so what I'm going to try to do is to provide you with a schema that describes the world of morality, roughly speaking, which is how to act, and tell you a little bit about what I think the language is, which I think was derived from Darwinian processes, and I believe that it's within that structure that the clinical theories logically nest. And so that'll give you a way of linking one theory to another from a conceptual perspective without having to rely so much on sheer memorization. Then we'll talk about heroic and shamanic initiations, and the reason we're going to do that is because, well, people used shamanic initiations for tens of thousands of years all over the world, and they have a particular kind of structure. The paper by Mircea Eliade, which is linked on the site, is a very interesting one. It details out some of these processes. There have been intelligent commentators like Henri Ellenberger, who wrote The Discovery of the Unconscious, which I think is an outstanding book, who linked the processes that the psychoanalysts uncovered in the late part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century back to these more primordial rituals of personality transformation. And so we're going to situate ourselves, in some sense, in deep history, talking first about the underlying mythological landscape, then talking about archaic modes of personality conceptualization and transformation, and then moving from there into constructivism. And we're going to concentrate mostly on Jean Piaget, who was a developmental psychologist. Constructivists believe that you make yourself out of the information that you gather in the world. So you're an exploring creature. You explore specifically when the maps that you're using in the world are no longer orienting yourself properly, when they're producing errors. You go out, gather information, and assemble yourself from the information that you discovered. Then the depth psychologists, Jung and Freud. I think with Jung, I'm going to walk you through some films. I'm not going to use the films per se. I'm going to use clips, stills from the film, but you know the film, so in chronological order. And I'm going to try to explain to you how you might use Jungian presuppositions to understand what the films are about. You know, if you think about a film, say, like The Lion King, which was an extraordinarily popular film, it's a very strange phenomena that you go and watch it, right? I mean, think about it. It's drawings of animated animals that in some sense represent you. They're very low resolution, but you perceive them immediately as living things, and you attribute to them motivation and motive power and understanding. You do it automatically without even thinking about it. And there's a classic plot that lies underneath those stories, and the plots are very, 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 very old. And that's why you can understand them. And the reason you can understand them is because life has a plot, or maybe it has a couple of plots, a multitude of plots, but life has a plot, and if it didn't, we wouldn't be able to understand each other. And so I'd like to illustrate that for you by analysis of some of these films. I think it's the best way to understand someone as sophisticated as Jung, who is very difficult to get a handle on. Freud, I'm going to do the same thing, although I am going to show you a film with Freud. I'm going to show you a film called Crumb, which is a documentary, and it's about a very badly enmeshed family and the attempts of the family members to, I suppose, escape it. I'll talk to you about Freud. I'll show you the film. That should give you a sense of Freudian psychopathology, which is a very difficult thing otherwise to understand. Then there's a midterm. The midterm is multiple choice. You'll do it in class. You'll have lots of time to finish it. It'll cover the material that we studied up to that point. Then we're going to talk about Rogers, Carl Rogers, who's a humanist. Rogers has a body-centered philosophy, I suppose, and he's interested as well in optimal personal development and the role that interpersonal communication plays in that. Rogers' hypothesis fundamentally, and it's a very interesting one, is that honest communication between two people can produce personality transformation. And you know, you might think, well, you kind of know that already because there's something very engaging about a deep, honest conversation where you're able to say things that you wouldn't normally say, where you're being listened to by someone who's actually listening to you and you're listening to them, and in the conversation you're moving both of you further to a different point. That's different than a conversation where you're right and you're trying to convince me, or I'm right and I'm trying to convince you, which I would say is the typical conversation. The healing conversation is more, well, what's up with you? You know, how are you doing? How's your life going? What sort of problems are you facing? What do you think about those problems? Can you conceptualize what a solution might be? Is there a way we can figure out how to get there? You know, it's a problem-solving conversation, and it's predicated on the presupposition that the person that you're conversing with has the capacity to grow in a positive direction if they so choose. That's the fundamental presupposition of Rogerian psychology. May and Frankl are also humanists. I'll finish telling you what the rest of the material is the next time that we meet. I should let you know a little bit more about the structure of the course. The second midterm is March 14th. And there's a final at the end as well. So the multiple choice tests are graded in that manner: 25%, 25%, and 27.5%. They're not cumulative. Each test only covers what you covered before, since the last test, including the final. You'll be required to write an essay of 15%. It's 1,000 words, sorry, not 750 words. And you'll also do an online exercise, a personality analysis, which is pass-fail. All you have to do is complete it and show proof of completion. It helps you do a modified Big Five analysis of your own personality, concentrating on your virtues and your faults, so it's an active exercise in the application of personality theory to personal development. And so that's the structure of the course. I can tell you there's a sign-up sheet on the syllabus. I've broken the essays down into multiple types across the entire semester. I would highly recommend that you go there and sign up. There are limited slots for each topic, and the reason for that is, well, I don't want my TA to have to grade 200 essays the last week of classes. We have to spread them out across the year. So figure out a topic and sign up. Please do that sooner rather than later. It's an industrious thing to do. It'll help you organize yourself. I'll post something that's quite useful about how to write, especially a 1,000-word essay. And I'll close. The essays are due one day before class. I'll close, by the way, by telling you who shouldn't take this course, okay? First of all, if you didn't like this lecture, then don't take this course, because this is what the lectures are going to be like. So, and they're not for everybody. I use a lot of loose associations and try to gather them back in, and I kind of wander around. That way I can talk directly to you, which I like doing, but I sacrifice a certain amount of organization for that. But my sense is that it's worth the sacrifice. The second thing is there's a lot of reading, a lot. And a lot of it is, I would say, a lot of it's hard science, the last half in particular. But the first half of a lot of it's philosophical in nature, philosophical/psychological. And so if you're not interested in that, like if you're a pure science type and you're not interested in the clinical elements, say, of personality, and in investigating the philosophical underpinnings of those clinical theories, then I would say this isn't the course for you. And so you should take that seriously, because the readings are hard. There's a lot of work involved in this course, and it would be better if you took a course that you actually wanted to take. So, well, welcome to Psychology 230, and we'll see you in a bit. Now, you know, I used this picture to represent my class, and you might not know anything about this picture. It's a picture of Jonah being thrown up out of a whale's belly after spending 3 days inside it. It's an old biblical story. It's a myth. It's a fairy tale. That's one way of looking at it, and I don't mean that in a derogative manner. We know, for example, that some of the Grimm brothers' fairy tales are perhaps 15,000 years old. They've been traced way back. They're really, really old. And old stories are strange, and they're strange because, well, they've been told generation after generation after generation. So you can imagine that something retold over such an expansive time has been reduced to its gist many, many times. And nothing that's in the story anymore is superfluous. It's all meaningful in some sense. It's sort of like a meta story. That's one way of thinking about it. Imagine that you took 100 books, 100 adventure books, and you had to extract out the central features of an adventure book. Now, it's hard to do that. It's like you're averaging across them or something like that, distilling them in some manner. Then you get a meta adventure, and it would be like a myth upon which all adventures are based. And this story is actually one of those stories. And I'm going to tell you what I think the story means. And I'm not saying that this is all it means, because most stories of this sort are in some sense inexhaustible. Just like great works of art are inexhaustible. There's more information in them than you can possibly articulate. That's what makes them profound. That's why you go look at them, because otherwise someone could just tell you about the painting and that would be the end of that, but that doesn't work. So Jonah is being spit up by this whale, and of course on the face of it that's an impossibility, because, well, you can't live inside a whale. That's why it's impossible. Now you may remember, and likely do, that you all know a story about someone who is inside a whale. That's Pinocchio, right? And you know, you go to that movie, maybe even as an adult, you watch that movie, and Geppetto's down there in the whale, in his little boat. You know, it's big, cavernous inside. You don't really care that there's a bunch of things you don't care about. You don't care that those are drawings and not real people. You don't care about that. And you don't care that the inside of a whale isn't a cavern. And you don't care that Pinocchio's a puppet, for that matter. None of that matters to you at all, and that's because you're really strange creatures. You don't even notice when you're doing something absolutely absurd, and that's one of those times when you are. But if someone taps you on the shoulder and says, you know, you're just watching drawings of a puppet. Puppets can't really move autonomously, and now he's at the bottom of the ocean. You have no idea why. He's going to rescue his father, and you're just sitting there and you're okay with that. And you'll say, shut up, because I want to finish watching the movie. And so that's interesting, you see. That tells you something about your unconscious if you're psychoanalytically minded, because you're doing something that you cannot account for. Now you might say, well, it's enjoyable. Well, that's deep, man. You're really going a long ways with that. The question is, A, why is it comprehensible? B, why is it enjoyable? C, just exactly what are you doing there? And you think that whatever you are doing there is so valuable that you'll actually pay to do it. Weird. Very, very weird. And you know, when you read about, let's say, the archaic rituals of tribal people, and you ask yourself, just what are they up to? You might think, well, they're up to the same thing that you're up to when you go see a movie. So, and then you might also notice that the most expensive artifacts, or among the most expensive artifacts that human beings create, are movies. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars on them. And we consider that a good deal. And you know, it drives our technology too, because the high-tech movies, like the Marvel movies that require so much computer animation, they actually drive the demand for high-end graphics chips. So our technological advance forward is actually motivated in part by our desire to represent things fictionally in ever more spectacular manner. So, Jonah. Well, let me tell you the story of Jonah. And I'll tell you why I'm going to tell you it. This is from Camille Paglia, who's a critic of the modern university and a very brilliant woman, I would say, very controversial, incredibly rapid speaker. She can think so fast, it's just unbelievable. She's really fun to watch if you like that sort of thing. Vicious adversary in an argument. She says the number one problem in academia today is not ignorant students, but ignorant professors who have substituted narrow expertise and theoretical sophistication, a preposterous term for breadth and depth of learning in the world history of art and thought. Art is a vast, interconnected web work, a fabricated tradition, and over-concentration on any one point is a distortion. Here's the problem. I wrestled with this when I was trying to understand some of the things that I'm going to teach you about. There's some things that you kind of have to grasp as a whole. You know, sometimes you have a flash of insight and a bunch of things that you didn't know were related fall together. That's supposed to happen in psychotherapy when you link different disparate patterns of behavior together because you've linked them, say, with a single cause. And you get this like excited feeling of illumination and possibility. And there are forms of communication that require the simultaneous realization of a multitude of disparate phenomena. Like a movie can be like that, you know. You listen to a movie, you watch a movie, and then you don't know what the hell's going on, and then something happens near the end, and bang! Everything clicks together. And it's because you've sort of seen the thing as a whole. And a lot of the ways that we interact with the world that are mysterious are like that. And this is what Paglia is referring to, is that, and this is a psychoanalytic proposition, I would say, or a romantic proposition. The idea roughly is that way out in the periphery of reality are all those things that not only do you not know, but you don't even know you don't know, right? They're completely blind to their existence. And then there's unknown things that you have some suspicions about. And then there's unknown things that you can start to imagine and act out and dramatize. And so all of that is on the periphery of our knowledge. That's a psychoanalytic dictum. Where do thoughts come from? Well, partly they're nested in dreams. Dreams are the birthplace of thoughts. Fantasy, it's not that surprising. Fantasy is the birthplace of ideas. You know, if you're thinking about what you're going to do in the future, you enter into a reverie, a dream state, and you contemplate multiple possibilities, and then you start thinking them through. Use your imagination to search beyond where you are. And the collective human attempt to do that is our mysterious, humanistic, artistic tradition, which is very difficult to justify from a formal, articulate point of view. What good is dance? What is it that you're doing when you're dancing? Well, you don't care because you like to dance. Why? Well, you don't know. But you do. It's built into you. Music. Music's a human universal. Cultures use music to organize themselves. Right? They use music to catalyze their identities. They use music to unite around. You know, in more archaic societies, less differentiated societies, let's say. You know, a mask that represents part of the family tradition will have a particular design, and there'll be a particular song written for it, and there'll be a particular dance about it. And the song and the dance are something like the symbolic representation of a mode of being in the world. Like maybe the mask is a wolf mask, so you act out the wolf, and there's music that goes along with that. And you think, well, what are you doing when you're acting out the wolf? But part of that is, well, you're trying to understand wolves. You know, it's imitation in part, if you live in the natural world, and if you hunt and are preyed upon, then understanding the things that you're hunting and preying upon is useful. And there's also perhaps useful things to learn from them. And so we play this strange symbolic game with the world, like children pretending. That's another way of thinking about it. And we do that to act out and to begin to understand things we don't understand, like how to act. That's, now for me, the most important question in life is not what the world is made of. And in fact, I would say that's a relatively new preoccupation of humankind. You know, we didn't really formalize, you could say that the ancient Greeks laid the groundwork for the emergence of an empirical science. And then it emerged more formally with Bacon and Descartes and Newton 500-600 years ago. Not very long, like a blink of the eye in human terms. Before that, people were engineers, they could build things and so forth, but they didn't know how to, they weren't scientists. They didn't really conceptualize the world as an objective place. We do that automatically because science has seeped so far into our set of presuppositions. That doesn't make us good scientists, by the way, but it does make us believe that the fundamental reality of the world is an objective reality. And I'm not going to dispute that particularly, but leaves one set of questions unanswered, probably by its nature, because it wasn't designed to answer the question. And that question is, how should one conduct oneself in the world? And that's an important thing, since you're alive, and hypothetically you'd rather stay alive, and while you're alive you probably don't want to suffer any more than you have to, and no more stupidly than you have to, and it might also be good if some of the things that you wanted actually happened. And so, you know, you're motivated to know how to act, and people are always telling each other how to act. We're sending each other information all the time about how to act. We do that with the expressions on our face, and of course when we talk to people we always look at their face, and that's because their face tells you what they're up to. You know, if they're smiling and paying attention to you, well, then you can assume that you're doing something right. And if they're looking annoyed or disgusted, that's a particularly bad one, then you might think, you might take a hint from that, especially if, you know, 3 or 4 people are doing it at the same time. And so we're reflecting some ideal to one another constantly. And the more attentive you are, the more likely you are to act in accordance with that ideal, and the more likely you are to move towards it. You may not even know what the ideal is in an articulated sense. In fact, you probably don't. You know, you could come up with well, you know, a good person is nice and friendly and, you know, cooperative. Yeah, you know, that's all just cliche. But you don't, you know, your conception might be very hollow. It's very likely that it's very hollow, even though you may be able to act in a very sophisticated manner. All right, so anyways, this is a story. I'd say it's a meta story. It's what would happen if you collected a bunch of stories and then you extracted out a story from them. And it's sort of a story about destiny, and it's couched in a religious language, but that's okay, because most of these distilled stories form the foundation of religious texts, and religious texts and myths and stories are, as I said, part of the outer perimeter of our society. They have a coherent nature, and they form a foundation, and it's on that foundation that everything that you take for granted rests, even if you don't understand the foundation. So I can give you an example. There's a metaphysical idea that underlies Western civilization, and that metaphysical idea is that the individual has transcendent worth. That's the idea from which the notion of natural rights is derived. And of course, our legal system is predicated on the idea that you have certain natural rights. They're enshrined in the Bill of Rights, for example. And in the States, when the Bill of rights was being formulated, when the original legislation that founded the state was being formulated, the formulators said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. What does that mean? They're axioms of faith, right? They're propositions. And there's no proof for them. They're a mode of operation in the world. And so the hypothesis is something like, well, if I treat you like there's something about you that has transcendent value, implicit, intrinsic value, whatever that might be, and there are stories about that and we'll talk about that, and you do the same to me, and then we set up a body of laws that recognizes the sovereignty of the individual, so that the law itself has to act with respect towards every individual, even if that individual has done something reprehensible, which is very weird if you think about it, then our society will work better. And, well, perhaps that's true, but for better or worse, that is what this society is predicated on, and that's a very, 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 very old idea. And it's an idea that people came to with great difficulty, because it was over thousands of years that people learned how to take their little tribal groups, which were always squabbling with one another, right, because they're human beings, they're very violent, and tribal groups are by no means civilized. There's no noble savage like the Europeans thought. If you study tribal groups in the world today, the death rate by violence is unbelievably high. So something unites a tribe within a tribe. It's often kinship, but then tribes come together to form larger civilizations, and they have to determine some sort of meta principle that guides them so that they can cooperate and come together without destroying one another, and they have to extract out a principle by which the society might function, and that has to work. And then as societies get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, they have to bring more and more of these diverse traditions together and extract out something from them that has power and functional utility and that allows people to unite. And so this is one of the stories that talks about that. It's the story of individual responsibility and what happens when it's not heeded. So, because we could say, you are a social creature, right to the core, and most of your environment is other people, and those other people want something from you, and you want something from them, so you're going to play games with them. You're either going to be good at it, or you're going to be bad at it, but you're going to play games with them. And so, the game might have rules, really sophisticated rules, in fact. And you'd expect that, because as your behavior more and more approximates an ideal, assuming such a thing exists, then you're more and more sophisticated. The nature of the ideal is perhaps more and more complex and difficult to understand. You get a hint of this, though. You can get a hint of this because you will see, if you pay attention to your own soul, your psyche, your unconscious, you'll see that there are people that you admire and that there are people that you have contempt for. And it isn't necessarily that you're 100% accurate in your judgment. It's not such a bad idea to criticize your first impressions. But those states exist. So there's a reason you admire someone. There's a reason you have contempt for someone. There may be multiple reasons. And that's a hint to your intrinsic value structure. It's a hint about your intrinsic value structure, right? You wouldn't admire someone unless there was something about them that you valued and perhaps that you would also like to be able to do. And you wouldn't despise someone or have contempt for them if you didn't feel that something they were doing was wrong and that it would be wrong if you did it too. And so you're bringing to bear on the situation an implicit morality. And you have to do that because, as I said, you can't act without a morality, because if you're going to act, you're going to try to make things better. Otherwise, why bother? And if you're acting to make things better, then some things have to be better and some things have to be worse, and that's a value structure. So you have one. All right, so Jonah, he gets a call from God. And God tells them that there's a city, Nineveh, that's falling into moral disarray. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's a universal story. It's like all cultures are always falling into disarray. It's their nature. Just entropy does that, right? Things change, the world changes, the environment changes, and the culture doesn't keep up very well, and then of course it has corrupt elements, and so it's an eternal story. The individual is always placed in relationship to a culture that's somewhat corrupt. And then the question is, well, what do you do about it? And if the answer is nothing, well then it'll just get more corrupt. And if the answer is be corrupt too, then it will just get more corrupt. So the answer has to be to oppose the corruption, because that's the only way it's going to stop. Now, God threatens to destroy this city because of its corruption, and I don't think you need to presume anything particularly metaphysical about that to understand it. It's very straightforward that the more corrupt the culture is and the less trust is possible between individuals, the less productive the culture is.
Hey, what's going on, Grim?
Why do anything if some corrupt person is just going to come and take it? You know, it might even be that the culture is so corrupt that if you are good for something and you produce resources, you're actually more likely to get killed because you have something of value. So, like, you're just not going anywhere with that. And why would you work if you didn't have any sense that, you know, you could store up the value of your work for some reasonable time in the future? So, if the society is corrupt and there's no trust, it's degenerating. And, you know, it might live for a while, but isn't going to last very long, and so that's the idea. Corrupt societies collapse. That leaves open what corruption means. Anyways, Jonah thinks, no bloody way. I'm not going to that city. They can go to hell as far as I'm concerned, and that's really what he thinks. And why in the world should I do anything about it anyways? And these are good objections. It's like, why would you do that? And you'll face this, believe me, in your life. You will face this. In fact, you already do, always, constantly, continually, in small ways perhaps, when you're interacting with people who aren't treating you properly. When you're acting, and those might be your parents, they might be your friends, they might be people at your workplace, they might be professors. They're playing a crooked game, and you don't like it, and you know it's crooked. And so then the question is, well, what should you do about it? Well, if you know it's crooked, it's not so good to play along with it. I mean, we'll say that you know it's crooked by your own standard of values. It degrades you to play along with it. You're going to stand up and oppose it? Well, no, probably not. You're probably going to do what Jonah did, jump on a ship and get the hell out of there. And, you know, that's a logical thing to do, but it doesn't solve the problem. And I think this has something to do with human ethical responsibility, because there are other old stories, and I'll tell you one likely, where the son of the king, the Lion King, the son of the king, he goes off, he's some pathetic adolescent, and then he's shamed by the reappearance of his old girlfriend into turning into something vaguely useful, and he opens his eyes and he goes back and he fights Scar, and you know, it's a scene of hell, right? Because there's fire everywhere, and he fights Scar, finds out Scar killed his father, casts him into the pit, roughly speaking, and then the rain comes. And then, you know, the movie returns to its beginning, fundamental. Paradise, Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained. That's the movie. And I mean, that's the story of human beings, you know. You're in a place that's working out pretty well. Something happens to knock you off your perch. You're down in the chaos for a good amount of time, and maybe you never get out. But maybe you learn something down there. Maybe you strengthen your character. Then you pop up to a new place, and maybe it's better. Better aim, better you. Now, I'm not being overly optimistic about this. I know perfectly well that people encounter impediments during their life they find almost impossible to recover from. But it's the best shot you have. So anyways, Jonah runs away. But God isn't very happy about that because it's actually Jonah's destiny. It's necessary for Jonah to repair the city. So God sends a storm, and the waves are high. And I think what that means is because the water is often a symbol for the unconscious. And that's because things lurk down there in the water and that you could pull up that are useful. Monstrous things that you can pull up that are useful. You can fish for them. You can go fishing in your own being for answers, which is what you do when you try to think. Right? You ask yourself a question and you wait. Maybe an answer appears. It's like, where did that come from? You didn't know what the answer was before it appeared, but it just popped into being out of nowhere? Who knows? So you fish. So anyways, the waves come and the boat's going to be knocked over. And that's what happens, I think, when you know you should do something. I mean, everyone has this experience, I believe. Perhaps you would be willing to put up your hands if this experience is foreign to you. Okay? There's part of you telling you should do something. And it's hard to do it, effortful, and maybe you're afraid of it. And so you don't do it. You just procrastinate, right? And so how do you feel about that? Good? I mean, so what, you feel that you're betraying yourself. Your anxiety actually gets worse, not better, even though, you can put it off moment to moment, but that doesn't
what am I
help.
working on? This is a sketch I pulled out from
You're not proud of yourself. You have a sense that
from my iPad, and I
You're
found
making
it
things more
like on my
chaotic
computer
than they
this
should.
morning, and I was like, you know what, I might as well
if
just
you
try
do
to
that
render
long
this out
enough,
and see where it goes. So that's what I'm doing today.
Long enough, if that becomes habitual, things will
I was
get so
actually planning on
stormy
drawing
around you
stuff,
that you'll
or like
fall right into
having more of a drawing style, but I just got
chaos.
caught up doing this, so
watery chaos.
yeah, I'm doing this now.
Maybe you'll
In this
drown.
brush,
So it's not a very good idea to run from your
Boom.
destiny.
This thing?
let's say. Whatever that might be.
it has a really good look
and
to
you
it.
need a destiny. You need
So
a
I was like,
place to aim
let
at,
me
because that's what
see
you
if I just
need.
render something out complete
You need meaning in your life.
with this thing
It's
and
hard.
see how it goes.
So, you
Because I get to it feels a lot like
So
pencil,
anyways,
which is typically what I
they
enjoy.
wake Jonah up and Jonah says,
using.
that's probably my fault. It's like I'm running.
So I've
away
just
from
been running
something
with it,
I'm supposed to do, and God isn't very happy about that. So why don't you just throw me overboard? And the crew isn't very happy about that, but the waves are really starting to come up, and Jonah's
Are you working on stuff yourself right now, or?
Problem. And so they draw lots, and Jonah is chosen, and so they decide to toss him into the ocean, and immediately everything's calm. So he's a center of chaos because he's not doing what he's supposed to do. Fine. Well, then a whale comes up and swallows him. And then he's in the whale for 3 days. Now,
Yeah, thanks, man.
that's
Oh, you're
a-
animating right now? That's pretty cool.
the whale. That's the whale that
How's that going?
Geppetto's
With in these Corona times.
It's a dragon. It's that thing that you have to go out there and conquer to get something of value. Now, when you've made an error, when you've fallen off the pathway, when you've deviated from what you know you should do, it produces a state of internal chaos and worry and concern. You're thrust into the unknown. You're thrust into unknown territory and chaos. You don't know what to do. And that's often symbolized by the encounter with a monster, like a dragon, or something that lives under the water. And I think the reason for that is, as far as I've been able to tell, is that human beings, because we've been prey animals for forever, in our battle with carnivorous lizards, for example, and alligators, and even dinosaurs, because there were dinosaurs around at the time of our most distant ancestors. There was even a cat at one point that was adapted with teeth to pierce human skulls. So it had a head that was exactly shaped to grab you here and put a tooth through the back of your skull. So like, we've come through some rough times, man. And we have a system in our mind that's a threat predator detection system. That's the thing that makes little kids
I've been
think
holding
about
up.
monsters
Oh, it's
in
been
the
pretty
dark,
good. I mean,
right? Because, well, there is
I understand it's like
monsters in the
actually
dark. Parents always say, well,
pretty
there's no
crazy for a
monsters
lot
in
of
the dark.
people,
It's like,
but
that's
I mean,
not
ever
true.
since I
The
started
dark is full of
doing art
monsters.
stuff, I
there
mean,
might not be any in your
what,
room
like,
right at that moment.
sit at home and draw
but
stuff.
that
That's
doesn't
pretty
mean there
much
aren't monsters in the
gig.
dark.
So as far as that's
Crimes
concerned,
take
like
place, like criminals
life
don't get
hasn't
up at
changed
6
too
in the
much.
morning and, like,
At least for
you know,
like me and
have
my art
breakfast
friend.
and go rob a
For
bank.
anybody who
They
isn't
do it.
art though,
They do that sort of
it's like
thing at
completely
night.
different story.
People do the things that are
I have
fit for the night.
I have some family
in
that's
the
like
night.
working in like
Lots
social,
of predators are
what do you call
nocturnal.
it, like
and you
food
can't
banks and
see
stuff,
very
like
well in
passing
the dark.
food to like homeless
And
people,
kids
and
aren't
it's like
stupid, you know? They've
they're working
evolved
like crazy,
to stay pretty damn
and like their
close
wages
to
went
the
up
fire.
and everything. They just need people to like work and
Because the
stuff.
kids that wandered away from the fire,
Yeah,
got picked off
everybody
by
has their own
hyenas and
situation.
lions and, you know,
But
crocodiles and
hopefully we can all get
whatever
through
else
it, you know.
the hell was out there to eat.
Yeah, what's
the
going on,
unwary.
Sinu?
So, the circuit that we use to defend ourselves against predators, as we've evolved cortically, that circuit has come to represent what we don't know in general. Because the predators, of course, inhabit where we don't know. And so, evolution is a conservative force, and we use the circuits that we've evolved to represent new things. And so, the unknown, the chaos, is often represented by a monster that swallows you up and pulls you down. And you know, when you're feeling terrible, you don't say, well, I'm feeling up. You say, I'm feeling down. Well, why is that?
Yeah, really.
Well,
Yeah, really
down
good
is
luck.
worse.
My dad's
I
one of
guess
the
you're
guys that
flat
drives
on the
around,
ground when you're down, or you're in a
like,
hole or something
passing
like that.
food to
Hiding
like
in a hole.
people that need it.
You know, it's down.
And it's like a real thing where like he
You're
has to like
threatened
take
by
precautions
something.
and
Maybe you're threatened
you know like
by
stay away from people
your
and
own
stuff.
inadequacy.
So when he comes
Part of
by
it,
like my
maybe that's
family's house,
partly
like he
what
has
you
to like
imagine as a monstrous force,
my mom will like
because, you know, your proclivity
make him
towards
food or something, and she'll like leave it on the
and your
front
weakness of
like
character is part
right
and
outside the
parcel
door
of
in the
why you
front,
happen to be
because he doesn't
in
want to
the
like come in and
underworld.
like
That's
pass
the
germs or
underworld,
whatever
the
if that's the
mythological
case.
underworld.
I don't think it's like super high
That's
risk,
where you go
but like you know you still have to
things
go through
fall
those
apart.
precautions, right?
And if you understand
crazy
that,
right now.
if you know that that's what that means, then you have one of the keys that opens up ancient stories to you, and you understand things. Your life can be organized, going very well, and then something comes up, and poof, everything changes. Some axiom that you were living by, and it might be the existence of a partner, it might be a job, it might be your health, any of those things, gone, and you go somewhere when that happens. You go somewhere. It's a state of being. You're still in the same world, but it's not the same at all anymore. Everything about it is different. It's all negative and dark. You don't know what to do. You're confused. And so, what do you do down there in the underworld when things have fallen apart? Especially if it's the worst possible case scenario and you realize that you actually had something to do with your demise. That's really annoying, you know, when something bad happens to you and then, you know, you grind yourself into bits trying to figure out what the hell happened, and then you realize that, well, you were playing a causal role. Now, sometimes you're so depressed you assume you're playing a causal role, and you weren't. It's not easy to figure out by any stretch of the imagination. And it isn't that everyone who does something terrible is at fault for it. But sometimes you find that you were off the path somehow, and maybe even that you knew it and you didn't attend to it. And that's why all of this hit the fan. And so then down there in that chaos, you decide that you're going to do what you're supposed to do instead. And then maybe you get to rise up again, renewed, if you're lucky, and then you can go fix the city. And that's what this story's about. And that's why I picked the image to represent the course, because really what happens, you see with the psychoanalysts, the road to health, if you're not doing well, which means that as you act in the world, you're not getting what you want. There's something wrong with the match between your presuppositions and your actions, habitual, and the way the world is responding to you. And so it's not turning out for you. And the question is, well, what can you do about that? And one answer might be to examine yourself for presuppositions and action patterns that are not serving you well, and to find out what they are and what to do about them. And maybe some of that is, maybe you're not moving forward because of fear, and maybe that fear is grounded in terrible experiences that you had in the past that you've never been able to understand. And maybe one of the ways of gluing yourself back together and expanding your personality so that you could in fact live properly in the world is to go back to those terrible events and untie them and straighten them out and understand them and drop them. And that's what psychotherapy is about, in large part. Psychoanalytic, behavioral, doesn't matter. What are you afraid of? What are you avoiding? What are you failing to develop? Maybe from fear, maybe from avoidance, God only knows, maybe from disgust. How can you get over it? How can you reclaim those parts of yourself? I said in the first lecture that I was going to try to provide you with a schema into which you could place the theorists that we're going to discuss. And it requires going down deep to do that. And there are presuppositions. My presupposition, and this is a psychoanalytic presupposition, it's predicated on a poetic tradition, I would say, on an ancient tradition. I learned most of it from reading Jung. It was Carl Jung that helped me understand that we're nested inside a dream, that we have to be, because we don't know everything. We have to take things as givens, and the things that we take as givens are nested inside stories, and we accept the stories as valid, and then outside the stories is the absolute unknown. You know, and that's partly, the stories are tricky, you know. One of the classic stories, it's a variant of the Jonah story, I would say, is St. George and the Dragon. That story was represented during the Renaissance and during medieval times. Thousands and thousands of ways. It's like the story of St. Patrick who chased the snakes out of Ireland. Same idea. And the typical St. George story is The Hobbit or Harry Potter. So in the second volume of Harry Potter, correct me if I have any of these details wrong, you remember there's that snake, the basilisk. So there's this magic castle, right? You guys have no problem with that. Magic castle, no problem. There's an orphan, he's an orphan, he goes to the magic castle to learn how to be more than normal, right? The Muggles, he has a Muggle family. We're not too happy with the Muggle family. Like, as representatives of normal people, they have some lacks. Now, of course, the reason for that is that, well, that's what teenagers often feel about their parents, right? They feel, Jesus, these couldn't really be my parents. I must have some other parents who are, like, together. Those are like magical parents, right? Parents that live in the sky. And, of course, Harry Potter has earthly parents. That's the Muggles. And Dursley, I think, is the kid. He's a wonderful piece of work. And, you know, ill-formed, eh? Spoiled, ill-formed, selfish, very far from the ideal. He's a foil for Harry. And, of course, he's appreciated and doted on, and Harry is actually punished for his virtues. That's a classic story, right? To be punished for your virtues. If you look at the story, the central story in Christianity, the central story in Christianity is about someone who was precisely punished in the worst possible way for the highest possible virtues. That's what it makes it an archetypal story, because there isn't anything more unfair than that. And so it's a limit, in a sense. It can't be worse than that. Being punished for being, you know, unworthy, it's like, yeah, well, at least makes sense. But to be punished because you have your act together and you're a good person, that's real punishment. And that's what happens to Harry. So, luckily, he finds out that he's magical, which is quite convenient. And off he goes to wizarding school. And, you know, that's actually like going and studying the humanities. I mean, it was when they still were, you know, because it's through the humanities that you make contact with the magic of your culture. And that makes you more than merely the child of your parents. Because you are more than merely the child of your parents. You're the child of nature, and you're the child of culture. And until you understand what that means, understand that you have two sets of parents, like the divine hero always has two sets of parents, you can't construe yourself properly as an individual. You're not situated properly in the world. You don't know what your responsibilities are. You can't orient your values properly. And you will suffer from that. far as I can tell, because life is so difficult, you have to do something that's truly worthwhile in order to justify it. And so, well, that's what all these stories tell you. That's what the story of Jonah is telling you. It's like you have an ethical duty to straighten things up. And if you don't do it, you're going to be sorry. And that story is echoed everywhere. Well, now St. George, well, let's go to Harry Potter. That's what we're talking about. So he goes off to the magic castle, and he's learning to be a wizard. And he's kind of an interesting character, because he's not really good. And we find out, I think that's because, does he have a piece of Voldemort in him? Isn't that what happens? Yeah. And that's what that means, is that to be good, truly good, you can't just follow rules. That's very clear in the Harry Potter story. And you also have to be able to understand malevolence. And in order to understand malevolence so that you can withstand it, you have to understand that part of you that's malevolent. Because if you don't, you're naive. And if you're naive, you're easy pickings. And so that's a Jungian idea too. And the Jungian idea is that part of personality development is to understand your shadow. And the shadow is those things about you that you do not want to admit to. And you can learn about your shadow by reading history. You can read about Auschwitz. You can read about the concentration camps in Russia. And you can imagine yourself as a guard instead of as a heroic rescuer of unfortunate victims, which would be very, very unlikely. And once you can imagine yourself as a guard, which is a terrifying thing to do, then you understand something about yourself. And I actually think, and I think this is also from students studying Jung, that you cannot have proper respect for yourself until you know that you're a monster. Because you won't act carefully enough. You know, if you think, well, I'm a nice person, I never do anyone any harm, it's like, you're no saint. You can be sure of that. And the harm that you do people can come in many, many ways. And so, if you regard yourself as harmless, inoffensive, nice, well, why do you have any reason to be careful? You're like a teddy bear sitting on a shelf. Even if you throw it at someone, no one's going to get hurt. But that isn't what you're like, because you're a human being, and human beings are some vicious creatures. And there's utility in knowing that, because it's also the case, you know, in the Harry Potter series, Harry could stand up against Voldemort and understand him and speak his language because he was infected by him to some degree. Very, very interesting idea. Anyways, in the second, and the reason I'm telling you this, and this is worth thinking about, it's like, how long were each of those books? 500 pages? They're long, eh? And there was, how many of them? 7? And how many of them were sold? I mean, how many of you read every Harry Potter book? Right? That's, how many of you read at least one? Okay, how many of you saw the movies? Like, you're all in a cult. You are, I'm telling you, really, that's the truth. It's really the truth. So, in the second volume, there's this snake that's zipping around there, the basilisk, right? And it lives in the underground. That's chaos. That's chaos. And that's because wherever you are, you're on thin ice, and underneath your thin ice is chaos. And here we are in this unbelievably civilized environment, and everyone's getting along so perfectly. But you know, we've got lights, we've got electricity, the sewage system is working, no one's hungry. It's like, it can be peaceful. But if any of that fell apart, and it could easily fall apart because it's a bloody miracle it ever works at all, then the chaos that's just underneath the surface is going to come up right now. And it's useful to know that, because it makes you properly grateful. If you really understand it, it makes you properly grateful for the bloody miracle that it is that you can be here in peace. So anyways, there's this snake that's underneath the surface, and it's, you know, no joke, that thing. It's big, and it's ancient. It's always been there. And what happens if you look at it? It turns you to stone, right? It paralyzes you. Well, that's the Gorgon, that's Medusa. the woman with the head of snakes, and if you look at her, it paralyzes you. Well, what does that mean? Well, you're walking through the jungle and a big snake appears. What do? You freeze, and no bloody wonder, because you're a prey animal, and that's what they do when they see things that are going to eat them. And so, the snake, well, lots of people still die from snake bite. And our ancestors would, and I mean our ancestors like tens of millions of years ago, when they were living in trees and weren't very big, they made a nice snack for a snake. And there's a woman named Lynn Isbell, who's an anthropologist at UCLA, who's correlated the presence of carnivorous snakes with the acuity of primate vision. And what she found was that the more snakes around, the better the primates could see. So, and we're particularly good at picking up patterns like snake camouflage in the lower half of our visual quadrant. And people generally don't like snakes. You can learn to handle them. But no, snake fear appears to be innate. It's innate in chimpanzees, and it tends to increase as you age rather than decrease. You can overcome it, but, well, my daughter had snakes, and one day her snake bit her. It was a fairly big snake, and she hadn't paid attention to it for a while, so it nailed her. And from then on, she had a very difficult time grabbing the snake. It was like bitten once, shy permanently. She also told me years later she had nightmares about snakes all the time when she had a snake in her room. It's like, and I think it was probably the smell. So, anyways, so Harry Potter decides he's going to go after the basilisk, right? He's going to go out there and face the thing that he's most afraid of. So he does that, way down in the depths. So it's like Jonah going down into the depths. And he faces the basilisk, and it bites him. And that's right, because if you go down into the depths, you can get bitten. Like, it's no joke. And this is a hero story, but the thing about the hero story is it's actually real. The thing that you're facing is actually dangerous. And even though facing it voluntarily might be your best bet, and is likely your best bet, because that's the central story of humanity, that doesn't mean you're going to succeed. It's the real thing. So anyways, he gets bitten, right? And he's going to die. Now, he's rescuing Ginny. So that's the St. George story. If you go after the dragon, dragons like to capture virgins. God only knows why. I think it's because one of the things that male humans have done from the beginning of time is chase the damn predators away. And I suspect that the males from God only knows how long ago, who were particularly good at that, were rewarded with female attention. And why the hell not? So it's deeply rooted inside of us, that idea of facing the unknown and freeing the woman. So the idea there is that it's a male idea in large part. I can talk about the central female myth, and I will as we proceed. The idea is that if you're the sort of person who can stand up against the unknown and the frightening, then you're also likely, if you develop into that sort of person, then you're also likely to develop into the sort of person that other people will find attractive. So, and that's why Jung believed that inside the shadow was the anima, which is like a female figure. And so his idea was something like, if you watch movies, there's always this beta male guy, if they're romantic movies, and he's a nice guy, and he's the friend, and the woman tells him everything, but she doesn't like him a bit. She likes the guy who's got an edge, and who's capable of, I would say, mayhem, but at least of aggression. Now, that doesn't mean she wants him to be aggressive, but what it does mean is that she wants him to be able to be aggressive. That would be good. And so he's the romantic target, and so he's the person that's incorporated in the shadow. And he's someone that is respectable and perhaps useful. And so, well, that's a very old story. So let's think about this for a minute. I've already offered you a proposition, and I think it's an important proposition, and I'm I'm offering you this proposition so that you can make sense of art and literature and mythology and religion and dance and all those strange ritualistic things that human beings do, which seem central to us, including, not least, the ineradicable tendency of us to seek out stories of heroes. I should finish the Harry Potter story. So Harry Potter goes down there to rescue Virginia. No, it's that's not her name. What is it?
Right.
Ginny, yeah. But there's a formal name for that. It's a variant of Virginia anyways, which is a variant of virgin. So, and he gets bitten. Yes, Ginevra, that's it. He gets bitten, and the bite is poison. And so there he is, dying, which doesn't seem to be so good. And then what happens? And again, you guys swallow this, it's no problem. So, what's his name, the Dumbledore character? He's got a bird, right? So he's the wise old man. He's the ruler of the castle. He's the ruler of the magic castle. He's the magic king. You know, he's like God the Father as far as Harry Potter is concerned. And he has a bird. What kind of bird is it? It's a phoenix, right? And one of the things that's very strange about a phoenix is that, well, it's immortal, but in a strange way. You know, it lives and lives, I think, 100 years, and it gets older and older, and then one day, poof, it bursts into flames and turns into an egg, and then you get a new phoenix. So that's a symbol of transformation. It's a symbol of transformation. The bird is a spirit or psyche. And so here's what it means in part. You know how when you learn a lesson in your life that's not very pleasant? Right? It's not like when you learn something important, it's the best day of your life. It's often, the importance of what you learn is often proportionate to just how wretched it is to learn it. You know, you learn things the hard way. You learn things by getting hit, because obviously, if what you're doing is working, you get what you want. There's no learning in that, and that's happy. It's when you're doing something and you hit an obstacle, and maybe you bloody well hit it hard, and then, you know, you recoil, and then you down into the depths you go, and you have to sort yourself out, and you realize that you're, you know, this particular kind of idiot, and that you should probably fix that, and that's really annoying and difficult, and, you know, and maybe you're down in the dumps and anxious for quite a while, and then you get it repaired more or less, and, you know, you put yourself back together. That's the phoenix. Poof, into flames, bang, egg, new you. And so, you know, that's the ability to learn. Now, human beings are very strange creatures, right? Because we're very malleable compared to most animals, you know, like grizzly bears now and grizzly bears 1,000 years ago. It's like, whatever. They're the same thing. They do the same thing. There's no transformation. Human beings, we have this massive brain, and, you know, it's a pain because it means you have to take care of human children until they're 40, and that's a big burden. And so, you know, we pay a big price for it. It also makes childbirth very difficult, and it's costly. You have to eat a lot because you have a big brain, because it uses up a lot of energy. And so, you know, you pay a price for it. But the advantage is you're plastic. You can learn. Now, learning is a strange thing, because you can think of it as just acquiring more information. But you could also think of it, and this is more accurate, as finding out something that you're doing wrong, so that's sort of built into you, like a character element of your character, a presumption of your perception, or a deep habit. It's really built into you. It's a neural structure, right? It's alive. And you have to kill it because it isn't working properly. And the pain that you go through, in part, when you're suffering because you did something stupid, is it's something like the neurology. I never get this quite right. It's the pain of the death of that structure. And that can be a huge chunk of you, you know, if you really have to go through a massive revision. It's like the person that comes out the other end might hardly be the same at all. You know, that happens, for example, if you're trying to combat alcoholism, which is just, you know, a wretched thing to do because, well, all your friends are alcoholic, all your family drinks too much, the only thing you know how to do when you're socializing is to go to the bar and drink too much. You know, and you spend like 20 hours a week on it. It's like, it's not just that you're addicted to the substance, it's like that's how you live. And so if you want to stop being an alcoholic, not only do you have to stop drinking alcohol, but you have to stop seeing all your drunk friends, and then maybe you've had them for your whole life, and you have to have continual battles with your drunk family, and then you have to figure out something to do with that 20 hours that's now like hanging around your neck like an albatross. And so you have to let that whole part of your personality die, and a new part has to spring forth. And that's what the phoenix is. And the phoenix is the capacity of the person to transform. And so when Harry gets bit by the snake that freezes him, he gets seriously injured, the phoenix comes in, cries some tears in his wound, it repairs him, bang, he's back to life. And the strange thing is that that's okay with all of the viewers. Now, why would that be? There's nothing about it that's rational. Nothing, right? Magic castle, that's not rational. Giant snake underneath it, that's a little more rational. Turning you to stone, going down there to face it, being rejuvenated by a phoenix, it's like, yeah, that's okay. We'll watch that. We'll swallow it. We'll be completely engaged in it. And the reason for that is because it's a myth. It's about how people, it's a meta story about how to act, about how to conduct yourself in the world, to face the things that you're afraid of that would otherwise paralyze you, to let the death of what is insufficient about you occur, and then to wait for the rebirth. Okay, so science is about what the world is. And myth and drama and dream and the unconscious, all of that. Let's say the aesthetic and artistic and fantastic side of humanity. That's more about how things should be. It's more about how to act. They're lessons in how to act. And they're abstract lessons. People are capable of abstraction, right? So you say, well, there's something good about you, and there's something good about you, and there's something good about you, and there's something bad about you, and you, and you. And so we'll take all the good things and make one good thing out of that. We'll take all the bad things and make one bad thing out of that. And then we sort of understand the difference between good and bad. And we get better and better and better and better at that over the centuries as we distill that. And then we have a figure of ultimate good and a figure of ultimate evil. And that helps us understand what those two things are. Those are the hostile brothers. That's a very common mythological motif. And you can say, well, they're at war inside you. And I think that that's a universal truth. It's an existential truth. The domain of ethics and morality is how are we in the world, and how should we be? What's the good? And the reason I'm telling you all this, apart from the fact that you should know it, because this is what you should know if you go through university, is that it bears directly on issues of health. You're trying to accomplish something, say if you go see a psychotherapist, you could say, well, I'm trying to get healthy. But that's not really right. What you're trying to do when you go see a therapist is get your life together. And that's not the same thing, like mostly when I'm acting as a therapist, it's not like I'm directly treating mental disorder. Like mental disorders they're just not neat little boxes. It's not like someone has a fully functioning life, but they have an anxiety disorder. And then you bring them and you treat the anxiety disorder and they go back to their fully functioning life. It's not like that at all. The disorder is tangled out into their life. If you're depressed, well, usually your workplace isn't going very well and your relationships with the people around you are damaged. And, you're connected in the actual world with all of these things. And so when you come to see a therapist, you have to work on putting your life together in a sustainable manner. And that's certainly not just removing the mental illness. It's very rare. Now and then you see someone who's depressed, whose life is together, and they're just depressed. Something's gone wrong, probably biochemically. And so with someone like that, you can often give them SSRIs. I can't give them to them, but I can recommend them. Recommend they go see a doctor anyways. And that sometimes just does the trick because, you know, their life is actually pretty good. They just can't see it, but that's bloody rare, man. It's usually the case that someone comes and sees you and things are in a serious state of chaos, and all of that has to be addressed, and some of it's psychological, and a lot of it's just practical. It's embedded out there in the world. That's what the behavioral psychologists are concerned about. So anyways, psychology, especially the clinical end, is predicated on, necessarily predicated on the question, how is it that we obtain the good? How do we aim at the good? And what would that be? When my clients first come to see me, one of the things I often ask them is, okay, well, let's say you look a year ahead. What do you want? What are we aiming at? What would, your life isn't the way you want it to be. How would it look if it was the way you wanted it to be? Or at least partly that way. And we aim at that, right? We look for impediments, psychological impediments, fears, avoidance strategies, that sort of thing. And we develop strategies. And we try to move towards that, I would say, ideal. All right, to understand the categories of myth, we'll say, we have to understand something about the nature of categorization. Now, categorization is a tricky thing, and we're going to run through some complicated ideas relatively quickly. You know, you think you put things in the same category because they're similar, but the problem is that, first of all, that's not an answer. It's just a restatement of the initial proposition. And second of all, you can put things in the same category that are by no means identical, and you often do that. And third, it's things that are similar are often also importantly different. And so picking which element of similarity, you know, like let's say you have a group of books. Well, are they the same? Well, obviously no, because unless they're, you know, all the same book. But the category of books is a pretty strange category because the content of the books differs completely. Well, you could still make a group of books and you pick some arbitrary element that unites them and consider that grounds to make a category. There's other categories, more scientific categories, and scientific categories tend to actually contain things that are very, very similar across multiple dimensions. Like protons are like that. As far as I can tell, there's nothing that distinguishes one proton from another. The same with electrons. And, you know, the set of triangles is like that because you can define it precisely. But most of the categories that human beings use aren't so neat. And the problem with that is that unless the categories are neat, like scientific categories, it's very difficult to investigate them scientifically. So, for example, you might do research on a group of people with anxiety disorders. But the problem with that is that the anxiety disorder category is so heterogeneous that it's almost impossible to identify the commonalities across all the people who are in that category, and that's partly because the category isn't actually a scientific category. It's a hybrid category. It's a practical category. I can give you an example of that. Many of the DSM categories, so these are categories for psychopathology, require, if you're part of that category, imagine there's 7 symptoms that you could have, or 8 symptoms that you could have that would put you in that category, like antisocial personality. 8 symptoms. You steal, you kick, you hit, you bite, you're abusive. I don't remember the categories precisely. But you can be in the category if you have symptoms 2 through 5, and you can be in the category if you have symptoms 6 through 8. They aren't the same symptoms, but you're in the same category. And you think, well, how the hell can that be? Well, that's a family resemblance category, roughly speaking. Lots of the things that we use are family resemblance categories. There's a prototype, and then if you have enough of the features of that prototype, imagine the prototype has 10 features. And if you have 6 of those features, you get to be in that category. But it means that the category is actually quite diverse, and that's one of the problems that plagues psychiatry as a science and clinical psychology as a science. It's a really big problem because if the categories aren't homogeneous, then it's very difficult to draw conclusions about members of the category. And the psychologists and the psychiatrists claim that those are scientific categories, but they're not, and they can't be, partly because they're aimed at the classification of health or ideal versus non-health or non-ideal, and partly because they play multiple roles, eh? I mean, the category isn't there just to provide neat demarcations for scientific study. The category is there to give people a language to talk about certain sets of symptoms, to diagnose, because, you know, when you come in and you have a set of symptoms, you might want to know what they are so that you also know what they aren't. It's really a relief often to find a diagnosis. And then, of course, the diagnosis has certain implications for treatment and for billing and for all of that, so the category has to play all of those roles. So there's multiple types of category. And the categories that we're talking about in relationship to mythology aren't scientific categories. They're categories about the world construed as a place to act. So here's a way to think about it. You're always looking at the world through a framework of reference. And you have to do that because there isn't very much of you. You can't see the whole world at once. And in fact, the amount of the world you actually see is so small you can't believe it. The central part of your vision is zipping around, producing a pretty high resolution representation of exactly what you're looking at, but outside of that center, like if I look at you, I can't see her eyes. I can see her glasses, but barely. I can't even tell whether you're male or female. The person past that, I can't see at all. Now you don't notice that, you know. You don't notice that you're that blind because your central vision is always popping around, illuminating that tiny space. But you're so damn blind, it's just mind-boggling. And I'm sure some of you have seen the Invisible Gorilla video, you know, where a gorilla comes into the video and you don't notice, which is somewhat shocking because you would think that you would notice a gorilla. But what happens is that you actually don't notice something unless it interferes with what you're doing. And because what are you going to do? Notice everything? You can't do that. You can hardly notice anything. So what you do is you pick something to focus on. It's usually something that you value, because why else would you focus on it? So that means that your value system determines the direction of your perception. Bloody well think about that for a minute. That's a Buddhist idea, right? People live in a kind of illusion, and sometimes that illusion causes suffering, and they can transform the way they look at the world, and that can release them from their suffering. But the idea that you do live in an illusion, well, I don't know if it's exactly an illusion, but you certainly do live within a framework of perception that's determined by your values. Now that is so weird, you know, because we never think of the world as something that reveals itself through our values. But of course it does, because you look at what you want. You aim at what you want, and once you've aimed, the world lays itself out for you, and that's exactly how perception works. That's why I represented it this way. You're always somewhere, that's point A, that's somewhere in some place in some time, and you always have some notion about what you want to have happen next. You know, you're going to go to the next class, maybe you've got a plan after this. In this class you have a plan. You're hoping to learn something, I presume, and maybe you have a goal with regards to a grade, and that's nested inside your desire to get a degree, and that's nested inside your desire to be educated and to have a career and have a successful life. So, attending to me at the moment, the reason you're doing that is because all of those values exist within you simultaneously, focusing your attention. And so, you're attending to me and not to something else, assuming that all of you with your computers open aren't surfing the web, which you might be, but assuming that you're focusing, whatever you're focusing on is directed by what you value. Some of that can be unconscious. In fact, a lot of it is unconscious, because you know it's very difficult for you to get control of what you're paying attention to. You know what that's like. You're trying to study, kind of a boring paper. Christ, your attention is just like everywhere. You know? Maybe you'll vacuum under the bed instead of doing reading the paper. You know, you can't get grip on that thing, so your attention has an autonomy, and that's another psychoanalytic idea. You know, because you kind of think, well, you're in control. It's like, really? You ever try telling yourself what to do? How does that work for you? I'm going to go to the gym 3 times a week. Right, sure you are. Yeah, I'm going to quit eating sugar for a month. It's like, how long does that last? It's like 15 minutes, and you're eating like 3 chocolate bars. So, this is Freud's central insight, I would say. You're an autonomous group of spiritual agents, let's say, personalities, and they don't really get along very well. And you, the ego, will say, is by no means necessarily in charge. And that's a very strange thing to realize, but you can really realize that by noticing how little control you have over your attentional focus. Okay, so you've got your point A, you're going to point B, you're always doing that, you inhabit a structure of value, and it changes what the point A is and what the point B is, but the structure itself doesn't change. And when you're looking at the world, what you see is not objects, you see tools, and they make you happy. Those are things that facilitate your movement forward. And you see obstacles, and those are things that make you unhappy. And when you encounter an obstacle, one of the problems is well, you don't get to where you're going, and that's a problem. But the other problem is, if you encounter an obstacle, the frame might be wrong, right? Because you never know. It might be just something that you can detour around real easily. It might be a fatal flaw in your whole plan. And so obstacles have this dual nature. They get in your way, but they can also take your plan down, and so they can produce anxiety. So my point is, and there's a book called An Ecological Approach to Visual Perception. It's a great book by Gibson, J.J. Gibson, if I remember correctly. And this is, although I thought of this a while back, I realized eventually that it was a variant of his theory, and what he believed was that when people looked at the world, they saw value first and inferred objects second. So for example, for Gibson, if you're standing by a cliff, you don't see a cliff and then think about the fact that you might fall and then feel frightened. You see a falling off place. And part of the seeing of that, part of the act of seeing is being afraid of that. Because your eyes are connected right to your emotional systems. And part of what your eyes do is tell you what the object is. But your eyes do all sorts of other things. Like they prepare you for action. They prepare you for gripping. They prepare you for emotion. And none of that actually requires the existence, necessarily the existence of your perception of the object. So there are people who have blind sight. And if you show them, so they think they can't see, but if you flash them an angry face, they'll show a skin conductance response. And that's because the visual pathways to the amygdala, which does facial emotional processing, can still be active. These are people who've usually had a stroke, so their eyes are okay, but they've destroyed the visual cortex. So anyways, it's perfectly plausible that at least at one level of analysis, when you look at something, you see its utility first. So you see a chair, and you might say a chair is an object, but I wouldn't say that. Beanbag's a chair, and a stump is a chair. And they don't share much in common, except that you can sit on them. And so, you know, the chair is basically conceptualized by its functional utility, and when you look at a chair, what you perceive is its functional utility, and the chair tells you what to do. It says, sit on me, and there are people who have prefrontal damage, and they engage in something called utilization behavior, and if they're walking down a hallway and there's a door open, they have to walk through it. They can't not do what the object tells them to do. That's called utilization behavior. So that's how the world is laid out. And I would say inside that domain, you're in the predictable world. You're in the world that you understand, that you know, and that if you hit an obstacle or if you're outside that domain, you're in the unknown. You're in unknown territory. In the mythological world, in the world for action, you can conceptualize the world as a stage for action. And this is a Shakespearean quote that sort of sums it up quite nicely. All the world is a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays any part. And you might say, well, is that really true? And the answer to that is, well, it depends on what you mean by true. And that really is the answer, because there are different ways of defining truth. And it isn't self-evident that there's only one way of defining true that's appropriate. You know, the definition of truth might be more like a tool. And, you know, we are tool-using creatures, and really what we're trying to do with our conceptions of truth is to work through the world successfully. So even science is subordinate, should be subordinate to our use of the world as a tool. Because if it isn't a useful tool, like, what are we doing with it? You know, just generating technology that might destroy the world. That seems like a bad idea. So I think that the world as tool is actually the fundamental sort of truth, and I think that that's a Darwinian idea, right? That our notions about the world have evolved through a Darwinian process, and that it's appropriate for us to regard as what is most real those things that reliably ensure the continuation of our life and the probability of our propagation. And if you're a true Darwinian, I don't think there's a way out of that argument. And it isn't self-evident by any stretch of the imagination that seeing the world as objects is the way that our brain works. In fact, I don't think it's the way it works at all. And I think that that's why we're so wired for stories, right? It's a mystery. You know, like, you won't line up for 2 hours to go see a lecture. But you'll line up for 2 hours, maybe you'll even camp overnight if your mythological imagination has been seized for God only knows what reason by Star Wars. And, you know, that's a source of mythology. It's the mythology of the modern person, and it fills a gap. And that's why people do it. So that, to me, speaks of the manner in which our psyches are constructed. And that's a Jungian idea. That's the idea of the archetype, essentially. That to be human is to participate in a certain pattern of being. And that pattern of being is acted out socially, it's acted out individually, but it's also part of your structure, even your perceptual structure as a living organism of your particular type. And it would be the case, at least in part, with the hero myth, which is go out where no one has gone before, face the terrors of the unknown, gather something of value, and return, is the central story of humankind. It's not the only central story, but it's up there in the top 3. And many of the dramas that you engage yourself in are variations of that story. And you watch it over and over and over because you're trying to learn how to do that. Because that's what you need to do to live. Okay, here's an idea. What's common among people? Well, we're self-conscious, so we know of our own existence, and we know of our own limitations. And so that means that we have a certain innate terror and fragility. Our existence is a problem to us. And in some sense, what we're trying to do when we search for meaning is to search for a solution to that problem. And that can be security, but it can also be mode of being, you know. And so, for example, being engaged in something worthwhile seems to be a good medicine for being fragile, you know, because you think, well, I'm doing this, it seems worthwhile, and the fact that there's a price to be paid for it and that things could befall me that aren't good, I'm willing to put up with that because what I'm engaged in seems to be of sufficient significance to justify all that. We all become self-conscious, and we're all trying to do something about that, figure out how to deal with it. So there's a landscape that we inhabit, I would say, within which that takes place. So there's a human being, self-conscious, doomed to tragedy, and doomed to be aware of that. The human being has 2 elements, and that's the element that seeks the good, and there's the other element that seeks, I would say, revenge and destruction. And we have our reasons, you know. If something tragic happens to you, it's tragic and unfair, and it really brings you low, the probability that you're going to become resentful and want revenge is extraordinarily high, and no wonder. And, you know, the archetypal representation of that is evil itself, and the archetypal representation of the good that you could do is the hero. And so those things inhabit us. They're permanent elements of the human psyche. And then what else is universal to us? Well, we live in a society. You could say, and that's deep. That's deep. It's not just a human society. Like, we've lived in a society forever. So, you know, lobsters live in dominance hierarchies. And they use their serotonin system, at least in part, to keep track of their dominance position. And so you can use antidepressants on lobsters when they get defeated. And they don't feel so bad from being defeated in a fight. And so you just think about that, because antidepressants do the same thing to us. We're so bloody social that the circuits that evolved 300 million years ago, when the lobsters and us had a shared ancestor, are still operating at the base of your brain. That's why status is so important to people, and reputation. I mean, that serotonin system governs your emotional regulation. How people respond to you and what they think of you, man, that matters. That's why you're on Facebook all the time and checking your texts and obsessing continually about your online presence, assuming that you're doing that, and, you know, contacting people frantically and seeing what the updates are. It's like, how are you held in the esteem of others? Very, very important, and that's because it determines your emotional regulation. It's really important. So we exist in a society, always. And the society has two elements. The tyrannical element of the society, that would be the tyrannical king, roughly speaking, a very common mythological theme. You see that in The Lion King too, right? Because that's Scar. And of course you see it in the real world, almost continually. And then the benevolent king, who is the source of all the good things about culture. You know, and you can see these things play out as mythologies in political terms. So I would say, for example, the continual harping about the oppressive nature of the patriarchy is part of a myth. And the myth is that society is oppressive. It's like, well, yeah, obviously, you know, because you have to be quite a bit like you, and you have to be quite a bit like you, even if you're not, so that you can get along, right? Everybody sacrifices a tremendous amount of their individuality to the common mode of being. There's a tyrannical element to that. But, you know, by the same token, it's the basis of cooperation and the stability of society. And the final element is, that's often represented in a masculine manner, by the way, society. And I think that's because our primary dominant structures, given the creatures we are, like chimpanzees, the primary structures of dominance are masculine. And then outside of what's known is the unknown. And we always have to contend with that. And it's wonderful in that it's the source of all new things, and it's terrible in that it's the place where all the things that destabilize you come from. And so this is a good representation, although not the only one. So that's the feminine nature, that's the masculine order, and that's the individual who's destined to suffer in the grasp of those two things. Yep. All right. Good enough. We'll see you next time. So today, to begin with, we're going to finish the last lecture. And then, with any luck, we're going to start the next one. They're thematically linked anyways. Well, all the lectures for the next, well, for the whole course, hopefully will be thematically linked to some degree. Given that nominally they're about the same topic, but some are more tightly linked than others. So I started telling you last week about this idea of the voyage to the underworld, and I want to tell you a little bit more about that. Jung, in particular, conceptualized the voyage to the underworld as a journey into the unconscious. The unconscious for the psychoanalyst is a place of fantasy and dream and implicit presupposition and habit. And that's all correct. there is an unconscious, and it's perfectly reasonable to conceptualize it that way. The big difference, I think, between the psychoanalysts and the later, more empirical scientists is that the psychoanalysts sort of envision your psyche as a place of living partial personalities instead of cognitive computational systems. You know, they took into account the fact that you're alive and that the parts of you are alive. You know, there's a neuroscientist named Gazzaniga. I don't know how to say his name. Gazzaniga. That's wrong. Gazzaniga. Yeah, I think that's it. Anyways, he did some of the earliest experiments on split brains. And so sometimes if you have intractable epilepsy, which I wouldn't recommend, by the way, one of the surgical procedures for mediating its negative effects is something called you cut the corpus callosum, and it's a very large structure in the brain that connects the two separate hemispheres. And you know, it's not obvious why we have two separate hemispheres, although I'll tell you a little bit about why I think it is. But anyways, they do communicate. And what Gazzaniga demonstrated was that you could tell one hemisphere something without the other one knowing, that both hemispheres were conscious and that the consciousness was somewhat independent. Really strange. It's very interesting, makes very interesting reading. You know, because it suggests that fragments of ourselves, you can think of, you have fragments of yourself within you that are like low resolution representations of you, you know, and the psychoanalysts
Dude,
think
oh my God, please.
they're kind of like one-eyed giants. That might be a way of thinking.
Not holding
about it.
alt.
Thinking about
What
it
is
in
the
a
deal?
fantastical way. So there's the angry you, and you know, you all come in contact with the angry you. It's rather rigid. That's the first thing you might say about it. It's impulsive and short-term. It doesn't think much about the past, unless it's bad things about whoever you're angry at, in which case it thinks about them a lot. It's not too concerned with long-term future consequences, and mostly it wants to be right. And, you know, when angry you disappears and normal you, assuming such a thing exists, reappears, you can be perfectly shocked about how angry you behaved. And in fact, sometimes, if angry you really gets out of hand, like it might in a battle, in a war, it might do things that you just can't imagine that you would do. And under those circumstances, you can reveal parts of yourself to yourself that are so foreign and so horrifying that it will leave you with post-traumatic stress disorder. Because it is the case that many, but not all, people who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, especially if it's battlefield related, get it because of something they did rather than something they saw or something that happened to them. And that's really worth thinking about. You know? I mean, there's a lot of weird potential nested inside people, and you know, you don't see it under normal circumstances because the circumstances are normal. And part of the reason that we like the circumstances to be normal is precisely so that we don't see those parts of people we don't want to see. And that's really worth knowing. It's really worth knowing because that's why people are so identified with their culture and why they need a culture. You know, like the terror management theorist types, they kind of think of culture as a mechanism that inhibits anxiety, and they think about it psychologically, like it's something inside your head, let's say. And it gives meaning to events and stops you from collapsing into chaos and protects you from death anxiety. But that's not right. It's sort of right.
It's not this again.
But that isn't what your culture is. Your culture is a set of value-laden presuppositions that you orient yourself in the world that match the set of value-laden presuppositions that everyone in your culture has and acts out. And so what that means is that when you believe something and you're among your own people, you believe something implicitly. It's the way you look at the world. It's the way you act things out. You act them out. Everyone expects you to act them out. They're happy about it, in fact. So there's a match between what you're doing, what you see and what you're doing, and what other people expect. And it's that match that regulates your emotions. It's not the belief system. It's the match. And so part of the reason that people are so tied to their cultural identity is because their cultural identity regulates their emotions. And in a profound way, like this is no joke, you know, I mean, one of the things that stabilizes human nervous systems is, well, imagine that you have a domain of competence. There's many domains of competence, and of course, in some of those domains you're completely incompetent. But they may not matter because you don't go into that domain. So you have some area of specialization, which you might think of as your sub-tribe, you know, your university students. And so some of you are lower status by the rules of the university game, and some of you are higher status by the rules of the university game, by the tribe. And so the higher status people tend to be the ones who fit into the academic environment, you know, and find it conducive to their mode of being, and who also do well, and their serotonin levels rise. And you know, the neurochemicals that moderate mood, particularly, are serotonergic. Serotonin. There's lots of other
for now. See you guys later.
But that'll do for now. As you become dominant in a hierarchy, your serotonin levels rise. And what that means is that happy things make you happier, and sad things make you less sad. It tunes your nervous system. So if you're down at the bottom of the hierarchy and you're failing, it's like, hey, hardly anything makes you happy, and every